So you finally opened this. Good. Because somewhere, right now, someone is talking about you and pretending they're not. Not loudly. Not to your face. And hallway voices. And quiet texts asking if anyone else noticed. And the kind of silence that follows your name the second you leave a room. You felt it. That shift. That pause. That look people give each other when they think you can't see it. You can. They said, don't bring it up around them. They said, they notice everything. They said it like a warning, not a compliment. And somewhere along the way, you stopped being surprised by it, because you already knew what they were only just discovering. You know this feeling already. Being talked over, being written off, being treated like you were slow to catch on, when really you were the only one who'd already caught on and was simply choosing not to say it yet. That's not a weakness. That was never a weakness. That was patience wearing a disguise, and patience like that doesn't announce itself. It waits until the moment actually matters. And now something has shifted. Not with noise. Not with an announcement. In quiet rooms. In conversations that go still the second your name comes up. In the way people no longer challenge you directly, they just work around you now. That's not paranoia. That's a pattern. And patterns don't lie. You have spent a long time being underestimated by people who mistook stillness for absence. They thought if you weren't performing, you weren't paying attention. They thought if you weren't arguing, you had nothing to say. They were wrong every single time, and slowly, without a single dramatic moment, they started to realize it. That realization is what you're standing in the middle of right now. Not a beginning. An aftermath. Before we go further, if any part of this feels like it's describing you, remember exactly where you were when this clicked. Because what comes next explains precisely why the people who used to test you stopped testing you altogether. 1. The kind of quiet that makes people nervous. They can handle loud intelligence. Loud intelligence performs. It explains itself. It wants to be seen, measured, applauded. That kind of thing is easy to manage. Flatter it and it relaxes. Challenge it and it reacts predictably, on cue, exactly the way you'd expect. But you were never that. You watch first. You let people finish talking themselves into a corner before you say a single word. And by the time you do speak, it already sounds different, because it isn't reflexive. It's chosen. Picture a poker table where everyone else is showing their hand through their face, sweating, blinking, glancing at their chips a half second too long. And one player just doesn't. Don't smile too early. Don't flinch too late. That player isn't lucky. That player is reading the entire table while everyone else is only reading their own cards. That's you, in every room you walk into, whether it's a boardroom, a family dinner, or a group chat that suddenly goes quiet. There's an old saying that still water runs deep, and it fits here better than most people realize. They mistake your calm for absence. It was never absent. It was depth they simply didn't have the instruments to measure. And once someone realizes they can't measure you, they stop trying to compete with you directly. They start trying to avoid you instead, because avoidance feels safer than confirming, out loud, that they were outmatched the entire time. This is where the discomfort starts for them, not because you did anything aggressive, but because your presence removes the noise they were using to hide. Silence doesn't attack. It reveals. And revelation, to someone who has spent years building an image instead of a foundation, feels like an attack even when it isn't one. 2. Why your silence feels like pressure. You didn't threaten anyone. You just stopped over-explaining yourself, and that alone unsettled people who are used to filling silence with noise. Most people survive on talking. Talking hides doubt. Jokes hide insecurity. Opinions cover fear. Movement distracts from truth. You don't need any of that scaffolding, so when you go quiet, the room has nowhere left to hide either. Picture a spotlight that doesn't move, doesn't flicker, just stays fixed in one place. Everyone standing near it starts adjusting, shifting their stance, checking their reflection in a nearby window, talking faster to fill the glare. The light didn't do anything. It just stayed still. That's what your presence does to people who are used to controlling the temperature of every room they enter. They start performing for an audience that isn't asking for a performance, and the mismatch is what makes them uncomfortable. You might wonder if you should speak more, soften yourself, fill the space the way everyone else does. You don't have to. Your silence isn't a gap that needs fixing. It's a filter. It separates people who have something real to say from people who are simply afraid of quiet. And once you stop needing to fill every pause, you start noticing how much information exists in the pauses other people rush to escape. There's a version of you from years ago who might have felt pressure to talk just to keep things comfortable for everyone else. That version doesn't exist anymore. Somewhere along the way you learned that comfort for other people isn't your responsibility, and the moment you stopped chasing it, your presence changed. Not louder. Heavier. And a heavier presence doesn't need volume to be felt. 3. Why they call you intense instead of smart. Here's the thing nobody says directly. Calling someone intense is often just a polite way of saying, I can't predict what they'll do next, and that scares me. They frame your clarity as coldness because admitting its clarity would mean admitting their own confusion, and very few people are willing to do that out loud, even to themselves. Picture a mechanic who has been faking repairs for years, charging for work that was never done, relying on customers who don't know enough to question him. Then one day a customer who actually understands engines walks in and just listens to the sound the car makes. Don't accuse. Don't be confrontational. Just know. That mechanic will never relax around that customer again, because the illusion he built only works on people who can't see through it, and now there's someone in the room who can. That's the effect you have without even trying. You're not walking around looking for flaws to expose. You're just paying attention, the way you always have, and paying attention happens to be exactly what certain people cannot afford to have directed at them. Why does it feel lonely sometimes, being the one who sees the pattern before anyone else admits it exists? Because seeing clearly separates you before it ever elevates you. That gap between what you notice and what others are willing to acknowledge is real, and for a while it can feel isolating. But that gap is also temporary. It closes the moment you stop needing them to catch up before you keep moving. 4. The moment they realize they couldn't bait you. There's always a test, early on, whether people mean to run it or not. A comment designed to provoke. A joke that's really an insult wearing a disguise. A silence left open just long enough for you to fill it with something they can use against you later. Most people fail this test without even knowing they were being tested. You didn't. Picture someone repeatedly knocking on a door that was never locked in the first place, convinced that if they just knock harder, something will finally give. They keep pushing, assuming resistance, when really there was never a door to break down, just a room they hadn't been invited into yet. That confusion, the sense that their usual tools simply don't apply, is exactly what people sit with after trying and failing to provoke you. When the bait doesn't work, it doesn't just fail quietly. It changes how they treat you going forward. They stop testing you directly and start watching from a distance instead, trying to figure out what you're immune to and why. That distance isn't disrespectful. It's the closest thing to respect some people are capable of showing without ever saying the word out loud. 5. Why your calm reads as a threat. They mistake composure for coldness because composure doesn't give them anything to grab onto. No panic to exploit. No defensiveness to twist into an argument. No need for approval to dangle in front of you like bait. When none of their usual levers work, they start calling the absence of a lever intimidating, as if your steadiness is the problem, rather than their own toolkit failing them for the first time. Picture a storm chaser standing in front of something that refuses to move, refuses to spin, just sits still no matter what pressure builds around it. Eventually the chaser stops chasing, not because the storm won, but because there was never a storm to begin with, only stillness they didn't know how to read or categorize. That's what your calm does to people who are used to reading reactions as information. You give them nothing to read, and nothing to read feels, to them, like danger. This is not something you're doing on purpose. You're not performing calm for effect. It's simply who you've become after years of choosing not to hand your reactions to people who didn't earn them. That choice, repeated enough times, becomes a personality trait. And personality traits like that are very hard to fake, which is exactly why the people around you can tell the difference between someone performing composure and someone who actually has it. 6. Why leaving quietly did more damage than staying to argue ever could. They expected a scene. They got silence instead, and silence they can't argue with is far more unsettling than any confrontation could ever be. You didn't slam a door. You didn't announce your exit or explain your reasoning to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. You just stopped showing up to a game that was never fair to begin with, and that absence spoke louder than anything you could have said out loud in the moment. There's an old idea worth remembering here, that you cannot reason a person out of a position they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. You understood that a long time ago, even if you didn't have the words for it yet. You didn't need them to agree with your decision. You just needed to stop needing them to agree with it, and once that need disappeared, so did your reason for staying. Picture a group of people standing around a table, convinced the table only holds value because everyone keeps sitting at it. Then one person quietly stands up, walks away, and builds something better somewhere else. The table doesn't collapse right away. But everyone still sitting there starts shifting in their seats, suddenly aware of how much of the table's authority depended on people believing they had nowhere else to go. You proved that wasn't true, and you didn't even have to say it out loud. 7. What their sudden distance is actually telling you. When people stop testing you and start avoiding you instead, that's not disinterest. That's a retreat. They ran out of angles. They compared notes with each other, studied your patterns as best they could, and quietly concluded that engaging with you costs more than it's worth. That's not you losing relevance in their eyes. That's you becoming too accurate to challenge directly, and accuracy is a very hard thing to argue with. Picture a pack that circles something assuming it's prey, only to realize halfway through that it isn't reacting like prey at all. No panic. No retreat. Just calm, steady awareness watching them circle. Instinct takes over fast after that moment. Not the instinct to attack, but the instinct to back away, because something in the pack recognizes, almost involuntarily, that the usual rules don't apply here. You might have noticed how conversations that used to include you now happen somewhere you're not. How invitations that used to be automatic now require more thought on their end. That's not exclusion in the way it might have felt years ago. That's calculation. People are weighing what it costs to have you in the room, fully aware, fully present, fully capable of seeing exactly what's happening. For some people, that cost is simply too high. 8. The intelligence that doesn't ask to enter the room. You don't argue to win. You don't explain yourself to be accepted. And that restraint alone is what makes you almost impossible to manage using the usual tools. Most people who consider themselves sharp still need something from the room. Applause. Validation. A nod that confirms they belong. Those people are easy to handle. Compliment them and they soften. Challenge them and they overreact. Ignore them and they spiral, looking for a way back into relevance. You don't move like that. You don't chase reactions. You don't beg for acknowledgement, and you don't need permission to exist exactly as you are, exactly where you are. Picture a room full of people shouting to be heard, each one competing for the same sliver of attention, and one person sitting calmly, saying nothing at all. Eventually, without meaning to, everyone in that room starts watching the person who isn't shouting. Silence that isn't seeking attention has a strange kind of gravity, and gravity pulls things out of their usual alignment whether they want it to or not. Your independence makes you almost immune to flattery, because you already know who you are without needing someone else's approval to confirm it. It makes ego traps useless against you, because you don't need to win socially to feel secure. And it makes manipulation fail more often than not, because manipulation depends on someone needing something from the manipulator, and you simply don't. 9. Why they're studying you in secret. At some point, curiosity replaces confidence in the people around you, and that shift is when real fear sets in, whether they'd admit it or not. You felt it before you fully understood it. The way certain eyes linger a second too long. The way conversations pause the moment you walk into a room. The way people replay things you said days later, trying to decode exactly what they missed the first time around. They are studying you now. Not openly. Quietly, carefully, the way people study something they've realized they underestimated. They watch how you move, not fast, not rushed, but intentional in a way that's hard to fake. They notice how you speak only when there's a point, and how you stop the moment there isn't one left to make. They notice that you never over-explain, never justify yourself to people who haven't earned an explanation, and never defend yourself against assumptions that were never fair to begin with. Picture a stage full of performers desperate for applause, and one person in the audience who never claps and never boos, just watches with steady attention. The performers start adjusting their entire act for that one observer without even realizing they're doing it. That's what your presence does. You turn the spotlight without ever touching it, simply by being someone whose reaction can't be predicted or manufactured on command. 10. The clarity that collapses their entire setup. You didn't challenge their intelligence directly. You simply exposed the possibility that it was never quite as solid as they let everyone believe. This is where the real shift happens, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly. You walk into a situation they've spent months dressing up in complexity, and within minutes you see straight through to the floor of it. Not because you're rushing to judge, but because you're not distracted by the performance surrounding it. Some people survive by making simple things feel complicated. Endless meetings that decide nothing. Endless jargon that says very little. Endless frameworks built more to impress than to solve. Confusion becomes their camouflage, because as long as nobody fully understands what's happening, nobody questions who's actually capable and who's just talking. And then you show up and, without any drama at all, cut straight through it. Picture a group of people proudly guarding a maze they built themselves, convinced it proves how clever they are. You glance at it once and quietly point out the direct path through the middle. No bragging. No performance. Just accuracy. The maze instantly loses its power, and so, in a way, do the people who were hiding behind its complexity. You didn't set out to embarrass anyone. You just told the truth in a way that couldn't be easily argued with, and once clarity enters a room like that, excuses tend to die fast. 11. The mirror they can't look into for too long. When people look at you, what unsettles them isn't confidence in the way they usually recognize it. It's acceleration. They see someone who processes information faster than they can twist it, someone who spots the outline of the trap while they're still in the middle of setting it. That difference in speed and awareness is unsettling in a way that's hard to name, so most people don't try to name it. They just quietly keep their distance instead. You don't cling to being right the way many people do. You adjust. You update your thinking in real time when new information arrives, instead of defending an old position just because it's familiar. While others are busy protecting the image they've built, you're absorbing whatever reality is actually offering you in the moment. And that gap between you widens every single time you stay calm and simply keep moving forward. Picture two people in a race. One memorized the map years ago and refuses to check it again, convinced the terrain hasn't changed. The other keeps checking the terrain, adjusting pace, changing routes as needed. It's not hard to guess who wins once the road inevitably shifts. That's you. You don't need certainty nearly as much as you need accurate feedback, and that difference alone makes you far more adaptable than people who are still relying on outdated maps. 12. The warning they pass around when you're not there. Here's something they'll likely never say directly to your face, no matter how close they pretend to be. You are the kind of person whose presence makes other capable people feel merely average, not because you're trying to outshine anyone, but simply because of the level you operate at without effort. For people who've built part of their identity around being the sharpest person in most rooms, that realization can be genuinely difficult to sit with. When you enter a space, you don't dominate it in an obvious way. You recalibrate it. The baseline shifts slightly. The energy in the room changes in a way people can feel even if they can't quite explain it. The ones who usually lead every conversation start to slow down. The ones who love to explain things at length start hesitating, unsure if their explanation is even necessary anymore. You didn't challenge them directly. You didn't compete for the space. You simply existed at a level that made competing for it feel unnecessary. Picture training for years to climb what you believe is the tallest mountain around, only to meet someone who treats that same climb like a warm-up. No bragging. No announcement. Just an altitude they can breathe at comfortably that you're still adjusting to. That's the quiet realization people have around you, even if none of them ever put it into words directly. 13. Why every attempt to undermine you build you instead. They thought pressure would eventually break you down. Instead, it trained you, sharpened you, gave you a kind of awareness you wouldn't have developed any other way. Every subtle dismissal taught you how people behave when they feel threatened. Every closed door quietly forced you to become more resourceful. Every attempt at exclusion pushed you to build something more solid and self-sufficient than what you were being excluded from in the first place. At first, this all felt confusing, even painful. Comments that didn't quite make sense. Opportunities that seemed to vanish without explanation. That confusion hurt more than open conflict ever could have, because at least open conflict is honest about what it is. But that discomfort is also exactly what forced you to start paying closer attention, to start noticing how stories shift depending on who's listening, and how praise and criticism are sometimes used less as feedback and more as tools of control. Picture someone trying to train a guard animal, and in the process of testing its limits over and over, accidentally teaching it every weakness in their own approach. That's essentially what happened here. Every attempt to pressure you into shrinking instead handed you a more complete picture of exactly how pressure like that works, and once you understand how something works, it stops having the same power over you. 14. The moment they lowered their eyes. There's a point in almost every quiet standoff like this where the energy simply changes, and you feel it before you can fully explain why. The pressure that used to follow you everywhere starts to lift. The constant testing fades into something closer to silence. The eyes that used to track your every move start looking somewhere else instead. That's not peace arriving out of nowhere. That's retreat, dressed up to look like indifference. At first, they may have pursued you openly, challenging you, questioning you, trying to corner you using authority, numbers, or simple volume. They wanted a reaction. They wanted proof that you could be shaken the way most people eventually are. But something didn't go according to plan for them. You didn't run. You didn't panic. You didn't perform the reaction they were hoping for. You stayed steady instead, and steadiness, it turns out, is exhausting for other people to chase indefinitely. Slowly, the pursuit turned into distance. Conversations got shorter. Invitations became less automatic. Criticism softened into something closer to silence. The confidence that used to strut confidently through every room now seems to avoid direct eye contact with you specifically. That's not maturity on their part. That's self-preservation, and self-preservation like that is its own kind of confession, even if it never gets spoken out loud. 15. The last truth they'll never say out loud. This is where the story genuinely settles, even if certain people never quite admit it, even to themselves in the quiet moments. What happened here wasn't luck. It wasn't a favor granted by the right circumstances or the right timing. It was closer to inevitability. Some people like to believe outcomes come mostly from connections, from favoritism, from simply being chosen by circumstance, because that belief lets them avoid a much harder truth. That clarity tends to outlast chaos. That discipline tends to outlast noise. That someone who sees clearly and moves with intention will, more often than not, outlast someone who's relying mainly on charm or pressure. You didn't get lucky. You got accurate. Instead of arguing with reality the way others sometimes do, you learned to observe it closely and adjust accordingly. Instead of forcing outcomes before they were ready, you positioned yourself patiently and moved only when the moment actually called for it. People who move like that don't need to rush anywhere, because they tend to arrive exactly when it matters most. They will likely never say any of this to you directly. They may reframe it, minimize it, tell themselves a version of events that lets them sleep more easily at night. But the truth underneath all of that stays calm and completely untouched by their retelling of it. You were never simply an exception to some rule. You were the outcome of a long series of choices that most people aren't patient enough to make consistently. And from here forward, this particular story belongs entirely to you. 16. Why your consistency unsettles people more than your talent does. Talent is easy to explain away. People can attribute it to genetics, to luck, to circumstance, to being in the right place at the right time. What's much harder to explain away is consistency, the simple fact that you keep showing up the same way, day after day, whether anyone is watching or not. Talent can be dismissed. Consistency has to be reckoned with, because it can't be reduced to an accident. People around you have likely noticed that your mood doesn't seem to swing wildly based on outside validation. You don't collapse after criticism, and you don't inflate after praise. That evenness is rare enough that it reads, to some people, as almost unnatural. They're used to being able to predict someone's behavior based on what happened to them that day. With you, that prediction model simply doesn't work, and the failure of that model is unsettling in a way that has nothing to do with anything you've said or done. Picture a lighthouse standing on a coastline through every kind of weather imaginable, storms, fog, perfectly calm nights. It doesn't change its behavior based on the weather. It simply keeps doing what it was built to do. Ships passing by don't find that boring. They find it reassuring, and reassurance, strangely enough, is exactly what unsettles people who are used to unpredictability being the norm. Your steadiness isn't a performance. It's closer to a structural feature of who you are, and structural features are far harder to shake than moods ever were. 17. The questions they ask about you when you're not in the room. There's a specific kind of question that only gets asked once someone realizes they can't fully explain a person using the categories they normally rely on. How do they always seem to know? Why didn't that comment land the way it usually would? Why does it feel like they're 2 steps ahead of a conversation that hasn't even happened yet? These aren't casual questions. They're the kind of questions people ask quietly, almost reluctantly, because asking them out loud means admitting they've been paying more attention to you than they'd like to admit. You've probably never heard most of these questions directly. That's the nature of them. They get asked in the spaces between conversations, in the moments right after you leave a room, in messages sent to someone else instead of to you. And the fact that you'll likely never hear most of them doesn't make them any less real. If anything, it makes them more telling, because people rarely spend energy quietly analyzing someone they consider unremarkable. Picture a detective walking away from a crime scene that everyone else has already closed the file on, except something about it still doesn't sit right with them. They keep turning it over, quietly, on their own time, not because anyone asked them to, but because their mind won't let it go. That's what you've become to certain people. Not a threat exactly. An open question they can't quite close, no matter how much they'd prefer to stop thinking about it. 18. Why you don't need their permission to be accurate. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people learn to soften their own read on a situation just to keep the peace. They notice something is off, but they talk themselves out of saying it, because saying it out loud requires a kind of confidence they haven't built yet. You stopped doing that a while ago, not because you enjoy being blunt, but because you realize that softening the truth to protect someone's comfort usually just delays a problem instead of solving it. That difference matters more than people give it credit for. Most rooms are full of people who can sense that something is wrong but choose silence because confrontation feels riskier than staying quiet. You're not interested in confrontation for its own sake, but you've also stopped being willing to pretend you don't see what you clearly see, just to make things easier for people who'd rather not deal with it. Picture a group of people standing next to a small crack in a wall, all quietly agreeing not to mention it because mentioning it means someone has to deal with it. You're the one who eventually points at the crack, not to cause panic, but because pretending it isn't there doesn't make it disappear. That single act, simply naming what's actually happening, is often enough to make an entire room uncomfortable, not because you did anything aggressive, but because you refused to participate in a shared pretending that everyone else had quietly agreed to. 19. The difference between being feared and being respected for accuracy. It's worth being honest about something here. What people around you are experiencing usually isn't fear in the dramatic sense the word often implies. It's closer to a kind of wary respect, the sort that comes from realizing someone can't easily be managed, outmaneuvered, or talked into believing something that isn't true. That's a very different thing from being feared the way a bully is feared, and it's worth understanding the distinction clearly, because the two can look similar from the outside while being completely different underneath. Fear based on aggression tends to create resentment over time. People eventually push back against it, wait for the moment when the aggressive person is vulnerable, and use that moment to even the score. Respect based on accuracy works differently. People don't wait to catch you being wrong, because you're not positioning yourself as someone who's never wrong. You're simply someone who's honest about what you actually see, and honesty like that, over enough time, earns a kind of trust that aggression never manages to earn. Picture two teachers in the same school. One rules through intimidation, and students behave around them only out of fear of punishment. The other rules through consistency and clarity, and students behave around them because they trust the fairness of the process, even when they don't love the outcome. Years later, students remember the second teacher very differently than they remember the first. That's the kind of impression you tend to leave, whether you've thought about it in those exact terms or not. 20. Why walking away from arguments isn't the same as losing them. There's a common misunderstanding worth addressing directly. Some people equate walking away from an argument with losing it, as if the last person still talking automatically wins. You know that isn't true, because you've watched plenty of people talk themselves into a corner simply because they refuse to stop talking. Silence at the right moment isn't surrender. It's often the clearest sign that you've already understood the conversation well enough to know it isn't going anywhere productive. This confuses people who are used to measuring outcomes by volume and persistence. They expect you to keep pushing, keep defending, keep proving your point until someone concedes. When you simply stop instead, calmly, without drama, it doesn't register to them as losing. It registers as something closer to being unreadable, and unreadable, to people who rely on predictable patterns, feels destabilizing in a way they struggle to name. Picture a tug of war where one side simply lets go of the rope halfway through. The other side doesn't win in any meaningful sense. They just fall backward, off balance, holding a rope that no longer has any resistance on the other end. That's often what happens when you walk away from an argument that was never going to resolve into anything useful. You didn't lose. You just stopped participating in a contest that was never actually about finding the truth in the first place. 21. Why your presence makes dishonesty exhausting for others. Dishonesty, even small everyday dishonesty, requires energy to maintain. It requires remembering which version of a story was told to which person, adjusting tone depending on the audience, keeping track of small inconsistencies before someone else notices them. Most environments make this easy, because most people aren't paying close enough attention to catch the inconsistencies in the first place. Your presence changes that equation, not because you're actively hunting for inconsistencies, but because your attentiveness makes people worry that you might notice them anyway. That worry is exhausting for the people carrying it, even if they'd never admit that exhaustion out loud. Being around someone who might actually be paying attention requires a level of consistency that a lot of people simply haven't built into their daily behavior. Rather than build that consistency, many people find it easier to keep their distance instead, avoiding the discomfort of being fully seen rather than doing the work of becoming someone who has nothing to hide. Picture a student who hasn't studied for an exam, sitting in a classroom with a teacher who has a reputation for asking exactly the right follow-up question. The student isn't afraid of the teacher exactly. They're afraid of being caught not knowing something they should know. That specific kind of discomfort, the fear of being asked one more precise question than you're prepared for, is close to what people feel around you when they haven't been fully honest, even with themselves. 22. The part of this story that belongs only to you now. Everything up to this point has largely been about them, their whispers, their tests, their retreats, their quiet recalibrations once they realized the usual approach wasn't going to work on you. But there's a part of this story that was never really about them at all, and that part belongs entirely to you. It's the part where you stop measuring your worth by how accurately other people manage to read you, and start measuring it by how honestly you're able to read yourself. That shift matters more than almost anything else discussed here, because it's easy to get so focused on how others perceive your calm, your clarity, your refusal to be baited, that you forget those traits were never built for an audience in the first place. They were built because, at some point, you decided that clarity mattered more to you than comfort did, and that decision, quiet as it was, is the actual foundation everything else has been standing on the entire time. Picture someone building a house far from any road, with no intention of ever showing it to visitors, simply because they wanted somewhere solid to stand regardless of whoever saw it. That's closer to what you've actually built here. Not a performance for an audience that happened to notice. A foundation you would have built exactly the same way even if nobody had ever noticed it at all. And foundations like that don't need applause to remain standing. They simply remain standing, on their own terms, for as long as you choose to keep building on top of them. 23. Why they misread your patience as passivity, at first. Early on, patience is almost always mistaken for something weaker than it actually is. People assume that if you're not reacting immediately, you must not have a reaction at all, or worse, that you're simply not sharp enough to notice what's happening in front of you. That misread tends to be temporary, but while it lasts, it can invite a kind of carelessness from people who think they're dealing with someone who won't notice, won't remember, or won't eventually act on what they've seen. What they don't realize, at least not right away, is that patience and passivity are almost opposites. Passivity avoids decisions. Patience simply delays them until the timing is right. You were never avoiding anything. You were watching a situation develop long enough to understand it fully before responding to it, and that difference becomes obvious the moment you finally do respond, because your response tends to be more precise than anything a rushed reaction could have produced. Picture a farmer watching weather patterns for weeks before deciding exactly when to plant a field. From the outside, that farmer might look indecisive, even hesitant, to someone who doesn't understand agriculture. But the farmer isn't hesitating. They're waiting for the one window that actually matters, because planting a day too early or too late can undo months of otherwise careful work. That's closer to what your patience has actually been doing this entire time, even when it looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening at all. 24. The cost you paid for being this way, and why it was worth it. None of this came free. Being the kind of person who notices everything, who refuses to perform just to make a room comfortable, who won't pretend not to see what's clearly happening, comes with a real cost. There were moments when it would have been easier to nod along, laugh at something that wasn't funny, or pretend a decision made sense when it clearly didn't. Choosing honesty over comfort in those moments occasionally meant standing apart from people who would have preferred you stayed quiet. That isolation, when it happened, was real, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than pretending the entire journey has been effortless. There were quiet nights where being the person who sees clearly felt more like a burden than a strength, where it would have been simpler to just go along with whatever version of events kept everyone else comfortable. You didn't always choose the harder path because it felt good in the moment. You chose it because the alternative, slowly dimming your own perception to fit in, felt like a much slower kind of loss. Picture someone walking a straighter path through a forest while everyone else follows a winding trail that avoids every obstacle instead of dealing with it directly. The straighter path is harder in places. It requires stepping over things other people simply walked around. But it also gets somewhere faster, and it leaves the person walking it with a much clearer sense of exactly where they are at any given moment, rather than a comfortable sense of being lost together with everyone else. 25. What happens next, now that the testing has stopped? There's a particular quiet that settles in once the testing phase is genuinely over, once the people who used to probe for weaknesses have quietly concluded there isn't an easy one to find. That quiet can feel strange at first, almost like something is missing, simply because you've spent so long being ready for the next test that its absence takes some adjusting to. But that quiet is an emptiness. It's space, and space is exactly what allows the next phase to begin. This is usually the point where attention shifts from proving something to building something. The energy that used to go toward staying steady under pressure can now go toward actually creating, deciding, moving forward on things that matter to you specifically, rather than things that were simply reactions to whatever was being thrown at you. That shift is subtle, but it changes almost everything about how the next chapter unfolds. Picture an athlete who has spent years proving they belong on the team, finally reaching a point where nobody questions that anymore. The energy that used to go into constantly proving themselves can now go entirely into playing the actual game, developing new skills, pushing toward goals that have nothing to do with convincing anyone of anything. That's roughly where you are now. The proving phase is largely behind you. What comes next is simply about building, deliberately, on ground that nobody is seriously contesting anymore. 26. Why being misunderstood became less important over time. There was probably a stretch of time when being misunderstood felt genuinely frustrating, when you wished people could simply see things the way you saw them without requiring so much explanation. That frustration is common, and it's not something to be embarrassed about. Wanting to be understood is a completely reasonable thing to want. But somewhere along the way, the intensity of that need started to fade, replaced by something closer to acceptance that not everyone is going to see clearly, no matter how patiently you explain things. That shift doesn't mean you stopped caring about being understood by the people who genuinely matter to you. It means you stopped needing universal understanding as a condition for moving forward. You realized that waiting for everyone to catch up before taking your next step would mean never taking a step at all, because there will always be someone who hasn't caught up yet, no matter how long you wait for them. Picture a lighthouse keeper who used to worry about every ship that seemed to be steering slightly off course, until they eventually understood that their job was to keep the light burning steadily, not to personally guide every single ship into harbor. Some ships will read the light correctly. Some won't, regardless of how bright or steady it is. The keeper's responsibility was never to control how every ship interpreted the signal. It was simply to keep the light honest and consistent, and let each ship make its own decision from there. 27. The people who actually belong near you now. Not everyone who used to be close to you needs to remain close to you, and that's a harder truth to sit with than most people admit. As you've become clearer about who you are, some relationships have naturally drifted, not through conflict necessarily, but simply because the version of you that used to accommodate certain dynamics doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. That drift can feel sad in moments, even when it's clearly the right outcome. What replaces those relationships tends to be smaller in number but steadier in quality. People who don't need you to shrink in order to feel comfortable around you. People who can sit in silence with you without needing it filled. People who don't mistake your calm for coldness, because they've taken the time to actually understand the difference. Those relationships tend to require less performance and less explanation, because the people involved have already done the work of understanding who you actually are. Picture a garden being cleared of plants that were never suited to the soil in the first place, making room for the ones that actually thrive there. The garden looks different afterward, sometimes smaller, sometimes less crowded than it used to be. But what remains tends to be far healthier than what was there before, because it's no longer competing for resources with things that were never going to flourish in that particular ground to begin with. 28. Why this isn't about winning, even though it might look like it. It would be easy to frame everything discussed here as some kind of quiet victory over the people who once underestimated you, and in some surface sense, maybe it is. But framing it purely as winning misses something important. This was never really a competition you set out to win. It was a process of becoming someone whose actions and words actually match, someone who doesn't need external validation to know their own value. The fact that certain people had to adjust their behavior around you was a byproduct of that process, not the actual point of it. Winning implies there was a game being played the entire time, with a scoreboard somewhere keeping track. Most of what's been described here didn't come from playing a game better than everyone else. It came from quietly stepping outside the game altogether, choosing to operate on different terms than the ones being offered to you. People who are still playing the original game will often interpret your different approach as some kind of victory within their framework, simply because they don't have another framework available to interpret it through. Picture someone leaving a race entirely to walk a completely different path, one that happens to arrive somewhere more meaningful than the finish line everyone else was racing toward. From the sidelines, it might look like that person somehow won the race without even running it. But they weren't running the race at all. They were doing something else entirely, and the outcome, while impressive from a distance, was never really about beating anyone in the first place. 29. What to do with the attention this has brought you. As all of this settles, you're likely to notice a kind of attention that feels different from what you're used to, quieter, more careful, sometimes even a little cautious. People approach differently once they've concluded that you see more than the average person does. That attention can be used in a lot of different ways, and it's worth thinking clearly about which way actually serves you rather than simply flattering you. Some people will want to be near your clarity because it makes them feel safer, more understood, more accurately seen than they're used to feeling elsewhere. That's a good reason for closeness, and it tends to build relationships worth keeping. Other people will want to be near your clarity purely to use it, to borrow your read on situations without offering anything honest in return. Learning to tell the difference between those two kinds of attention is one of the more useful skills this entire chapter has probably already started teaching you, whether you've named it directly yet or not. Picture a well that provides clean water to an entire village. Most people come to the well because they genuinely need water and are grateful for it. A few might come purely to see how deep it goes, out of curiosity rather than actual need, without any real intention of using what they find there responsibly. The well doesn't need to change how it operates based on who's approaching. It simply continues providing what it provides, and lets each person decide what they actually do with it once they've drawn from it. 30. Closing thoughts on where this leaves you. None of what's been described here was ever really about proving something to the people who doubted you. It was about becoming steady enough, clear enough, and honest enough with yourself that their doubts simply stopped being able to reach you the way it once could. That shift didn't happen overnight, and it likely wasn't the result of one single moment. It was built slowly, through a long series of small decisions to choose clarity over comfort, patience over rushing, and honesty over easy agreement. The whispers you felt following you were never really about you being dangerous in the way the word usually implies. They were about people recognizing, often reluctantly, that the usual tools didn't work on you anymore, and having to sit with that realization without fully understanding why. You don't need their explanation to move forward. You've already understood, on your own terms, exactly what happened and exactly why it happened the way it did. What comes next doesn't need an announcement. It doesn't need permission, or applause, or a lengthy justification aimed at anyone who's still catching up. It simply continues, the same way it's continued all along, quietly, steadily, on ground you build yourself, one deliberate choice at a time. 31. A few things worth remembering going forward. There are a handful of things worth holding onto as you move past this particular chapter and into whatever comes next. The first is that clarity, once developed, doesn't disappear just because the situation around you calms down. It's not a temporary state you rise to during pressure and then abandon once things feel easier. It's closer to a permanent shift in how you process the world, and it will keep serving you long after the specific people described here have faded into the background of your life. The second thing worth remembering is that the isolation that sometimes comes with seeing clearly isn't permanent either. It tends to be strongest in environments that weren't built for someone like you in the first place, environments that rewarded noise over substance, image over honesty. As you move into environments that actually value what you bring, that isolation tends to soften considerably, replaced by a much smaller number of relationships that are far more solid than the larger, noisier group you may have left behind. The third thing worth remembering is that none of this makes you better than anyone else in some absolute sense. It simply makes you someone who has chosen a harder, more honest path than the one most people default to. That distinction matters, because the goal was never to feel superior to the people who tested you. The goal was to become someone who couldn't be shaken by them, and those are two very different destinations, even if they sometimes look similar from a distance. 32. Final words. You weren't given any of this. You built it, patiently, through years of choosing to see clearly even when it would have been easier not to, through countless moments of staying calm when staying calm cost you something, through a long series of quiet decisions that nobody was there to witness or applaud. That's exactly why none of it can be taken away from you now. It isn't borrowed. It isn't circumstantial. It's yours, built from the inside out, and it will keep serving you long after this particular chapter closes and a new one begins. The whispers, the tests, the retreats, the quiet recalibrations, all of it has already run its course. What's left now is simply you, moving forward, on your own terms, carrying forward everything this process has taught you, ready for whatever comes next.